I'm a big fan of Neil Marshall. I think he is a somewhat underrated director working today. He has made such excellent claustrophobic genre movies like Dog Soldiers and Descent. He made Doomsday, which was kind of an okay Escape from New York style clone. But he also did the Sword and Sandal movie Centurion, which was fantastic, which also I think set up his future work on some of the best Game of Thrones episodes to date. So when I heard about him going back to his monster roots with The Lair, I was in. Does this movie reach the heights of his earlier films? Let's talk about it. This movie centers on Captain Sinclair, who gets shot down by a group of Afghani soldiers. These same soldiers find out where she lands and tries to take her prisoner, but she manages to fight them off and escape into an old Russian bunker that was left behind by the Russians when they had invaded the country back in the 80s. Once inside, she ends up finding these series of experiments that have been long dormant since the Russians had left. And they seem to be some kind of creatures in stasis. Now, at the same time, those soldiers that had tracked her down follow her down into the bunker, and the ensuing fight ends up freeing one of these creatures. This creature immediately starts killing soldiers and then chases her out of the bunker. She then comes across a troop of American soldiers who were on patrol when they heard that her plane had crashed. They find her and take her back to their makeshift base in order to debrief her fully. Unfortunately, though, one of those creatures being free leads to many of those creatures being free, which causes a major problem for this nearby base, which is housed by a bunch of sort of cast-off misfit soldiers who are definitely not prepared for this type of an assault. First of all, this movie starts out with some prologue text. Now, I am a sucker for prologue text. I love it. There is something about it that just always gets me immediately into a movie. It's a great way to set up sort of the world as we know it. The problem with this one, though, is it's not really getting us up to speed, as opposed to just kind of telling us what's already happened. So the text tells us that a few years ago, the US military unleashed the biggest non-nuclear bomb in the Afghan desert. The story that we're about to see is the reason why. Now, I think this text is kind of largely unneeded, and it ends up undercutting the nice ticking clock plot device that ends up being revealed later on in the movie, because you sort of already know it's coming. But whatever, that's the least of this movie's problems. Now, I can see how this movie worked on paper. A ragtag group of soldiers fighting an army of alien mutants. I mean, what is not to love about that? Combine that with some interesting set pieces, a good creature design, and lots of gunfire, and it seems kind of like a lock. And to its credit, although it's clearly low budget, I tried finding out the budget, but I couldn't figure anything out. All of its money is on screen. This isn't some bullshit Bruce Willis movie where half the budget goes to the star and then they have like this one set piece with a hallway that they shoot from like 3 different angles with some green screen attached. This movie is not lazy, and good for them. This is where Marshall's kind of past experience, I think, pays off. There are several real set pieces, from the military camp to the bunker to the desert landscape, and so the scope of the whole thing feels much bigger than what would have been, say, a lesser production. There's no standout stars in the movie. It relies more on sort of solid, everyday actors led by Charlotte Kirk, who co-wrote and co-executive produced the movie. Although I will say, we're going to have to talk about some of the choices made by these actors in a little bit. Now, normally, I would shy away from showing anything with the creature in review because, I don't know, I just never want to spoil what the creature looks like for the audience if the movie takes great pains in hiding the creature. But the one thing that I think hampered this movie is its desire to put the creature front and center through the entire runtime. I mean, by the 15-minute mark, you already see the whole creature head to toe. And then shortly thereafter that, you see many of the creatures running around, killing lots of people. So they definitely didn't go with the Jaws approach on this one. And the creature design is pretty solid. I mean, it's low budget for sure, and that low budget does show up. And in my opinion, I think we see too much of the creature suit, we see so much of it that it's kind of hard to hide some of those seams peeking through. But getting back to the story, when she's brought back to the US base, she ends up meeting Sergeant Hook and Major Finch, played by Jonathan Howard and Jamie Bamber, doing one of the worst American Southern accents I've ever heard, by the way. So no sooner does Sinclair get to the military base that the alien creatures immediately attack, and there's this big fight sequence that ensues where the base camp essentially gets overrun. This is where we get to our first use of plot armor. Plot armor is a problem in this movie. These creatures seem to kill every side character immediately and with reckless abandon, but the moment they get in contact with either Sinclair or any one of the main guys, they essentially just do anything but try and kill them. And then later on, Hook falls seemingly hundreds of feet down this shaft into the bunker, but then just like somehow survives without any explanation as to how, just kind of because the story needs him to. And so these are sort of the types of things that happen throughout the movie. However, after surviving the night's attack, this particular small group that comes together that's left realize that the only way they can survive is essentially go into the lion's den and blow up the Russian bunker where all of these creatures are living. This forces a sequence that needs them to head down into the Russian bunker and set up a bunch of C4 charges, while at the same time, Afghani soldiers are attacking them from the outside, and the US decide that they're going to just cut their losses and bomb the whole goddamn place. Like I said, the pieces are all here. You can see the aliens and like other genre movie influences here, and that's not a bad thing. The story moves along at a brisk pace, and it never really stops or slows down for much, which sometimes it works in its favor and sometimes it doesn't. For instance, they do an autopsy on the alien corpse and find out that the organs are human. But instead of looking at the data Sinclair brought back or piecing it together organically, they find out that one thing, and then Finch just kind of explains the entire backstory to them in one scene so that they can just jump to the next action scene. And the action is done really well for the most part, although I have a little bit of a problem with Sinclair. I mean, she's an Air Force pilot, but she fights like Rambo. I'm sure Air Force pilots go through martial training and all that other stuff, but this is a little over the top. I mean, she kills a bunch of guys in the beginning when she crashes, and then she takes most of them out in the bunker in like a 1-by-1 style, and then she becomes this one-woman wrecking crew later on with the aliens. And so it just seems a little bit of a stretch, which sort of brings me to Kirk's involvement in general. I mean, as the lead actor, writer, and producer, there are times where this comes off as a little bit of a vanity project for her. I mean, she never really gets vulnerable, and she's always kind of gung-ho and tough without ever really seemingly processing what's going on. I mean, she's a fine actress, but I would have loved to see her have a little bit more range in her character. Like someone that starts out less of a badass, goes through some shit, and then becomes one towards the end, as opposed to just being one from start to finish. All right, before I wrap this up, let's talk briefly about accents. I don't know what it is, but whenever movies outside the US try to represent American soldiers, they always give them these crazy Southern accents. Like, yes, there are those people in the military, but not all of them have these super over-the-top Southern accents. And if you aren't used to doing those, like, it can be really hard to nail down. Most of the cast here is British, and they just should have done a plain American accent, because some of these are straight up cringy.
You'd have to be crazy not to be. A lot's happened in the past 24 hours.
Back in North Carolina, people talk about Bigfoot like he's real as you and me. They all crazy too.
We already evac'd all non-essentials, and they won't send another bird until things cool off.
Anyway, if you like action-y B-movies with people in rubber monster suits with some solid gore and kill effects, this movie definitely is for you. It moves well, has some good set pieces, and the acting, outside of some accents, is pretty solid. There is some excellent blood and gore work as well, but for me it was just a little too corny at times for my taste, and I would have enjoyed them emphasizing a smaller, more intimate story where they didn't have to stretch their budget so much and could focus on the things they could do really well. Ultimately, their movie comes off more like a better version of those sci-fi original movies and less like a lower budget version of Aliens. I'd give it a C, but let me know what you think.